For over 30 years, 5 days a week, there was this thing on the radio called The Rest of the Story, just 3.5, 4 minutes long, around all over the country. Paul Harvey was the announcer. He did 2 other daily broadcasts that if you ever heard them, you will never forget them. The way he wrote, the way he sounded.
Hello, Americans. This is Paul Harvey. Stand by for news.
My first job in Chicago, making stories for NPR, my windows at the NPR Chicago Bureau looked out over a section of East Wacker Drive that was called Paul Harvey Drive, which I loved, thinking that somewhere not far from where I was sitting. Paul Harvey had been up since 3:30 in the morning, pounding out his scripts on an electric typewriter. At his height, he was on over 1,200 radio stations, which, by the way, is more stations than NPR has. Just a massive audience, 24 million. His daily show, Paul Harvey News and Comment, was the day's news delivered like brisk radio poetry, with some folksy humor or some conservative opinion. But his show, The Rest of the Story, is what I want to talk about today. A typical episode just jumps into the action.
Now was the winter of Ted's discontent. You could see the frustration, even the anger in his face and in his gait as he stalked down Madison Avenue that blustery morning. He had thought himself, hoped himself, a book author, a poet. But the great publishers of New York, had repeatedly demonstrated the error of his ways.
I have to say, listening to Paul Harvey makes me feel like I need to go back to radio school. He just has this incredibly musical sense of timing, of when to pause, when to take the pitch of his voice up and down, which he would do like a singer climbing up and down the scales. Listen to the way he performs the next few sentences as just one long sentence, including the dialogue.
A volume of verse? Oh, no. Verse was not selling these days anyhow. Ted's particular volume was simply too different from others in its category. And worse still, it was too fantastic.
Who sounds like that?
Sorry, they had said. 27 times. 27 respected publishing houses had perused Ted's imagined masterpiece and rejected it. And not all of them politely.
Ted had learned his lesson. He decided he's going to go home and had a plan for his manuscript.
And he was going to vent his aggravation by burning that document, A Bonfire of the Inanities.
Nice tip of the hat there to the title of a Tom Wolfe novel, or possibly to 15th century church history. Then Ted runs into a guy he knew from school, Mike McClintock, there on Madison Avenue. And Mike invites him up to his office.
Well, Mike's new office, the establishment by which he had been hired only 3 hours earlier, was Vanguard Press, a publisher, and more significant, a publisher Ted had somehow overlooked. And you have guessed the rest. Ted did get published. And he got famous. And later he would marvel if I'd been going down the other side of Madison Avenue that morning, I'd be in the dry cleaning business instead. For once upon a grotesque disappointment, in the winter of 1937, following an intolerable 27 turndowns by the high priests of the publishing industry of New York, there was a little volume on the verge of incineration entitled, And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. And that was followed by Horton Hatches the Egg. And that was followed by How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Then came The Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham and The Lorax. Of course, you know their creator is Ted Geisel. You know him by his pen name, Dr. Seuss. Only now you know the rest of the story.
Lots of episodes of The Rest of the Story are like this one, about somebody who fails at something for a long time, and then there's a lucky break, and everything changes. So, for example, there's the skinny, shy, lonely kid who gets beat up till a fireman teaches him to stand and fight. And he became
the two-fisted, ultimately tough screen legend you knew as John Wayne.
Or there's the 14-year-old boy who writes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt asking for $10, who turns out to be
Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro is actually unusual. Most of the Rest of the Story episodes are about white guys. I sent away for this MP3 archive of 663 episodes. 34 were women. Sometimes Paul Harvey would go historical, like when he tells the story of a practice that was banned in England and colonial America because it led to disorder in the streets, unruly mobs spilling into churches, profanity. But people would not stop doing this thing. It went underground and continues to this day.
Americans simply could not
still cannot kick the habit of observing Christmas.
I went back and listened to a bunch of these in preparing this week's show, and I've wondered if you could tell the story of the rest of the story in the style of the rest of the story. Okay, here's my best shot at that. Mr. Arant was 28 years old, a concert pianist, doing great, performed with orchestras all over the world. But then he decided to make a change, something that would be less nerve-wracking than waking up to perform. His new gig? Writing radio scripts, 5 a week, for somebody else to read. They made thousands this way together. The guy on the radio got all the credit. People thought of it as his show. The person who got all the credit was Paul Harvey. Mr. Arant was in the background. And who was Mr. Arant? Well, I should tell you his full name. Paul Arant Jr. His father? Well, some people once knew him as Paul Arant, but you know him by a different name. Paul Harvey. That's right. Every episode of the rest of the story was written for Paul Harvey by his own son. And now you know the rest of the story.